money if they backed Alexander. But in all likelihood, the stereotype of Elagabalus the crazy hedonist was not invented out of whole cloth. These things come from somewhere. And everyone in Rome sure seemed pretty happy when he was gone. Next week, we'll get into the tragic reign of his successor, Alexander Severus, who tried in every way to be the polar opposite of Elagabalus. He was smart, conscientious, dedicated, and made a habit of listening to those who needed to be listened to, and ignoring those who needed to be ignored. Young Alexander always showed maturity and vision beyond his years, but the era into which he was born refused to reward his unimpeachable character, and instead used it as an excuse to stab him in the back. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 105, The Last Princeps. The reign of Alexander Severus was the calm before the storm. The clouds had begun to gather with the death of Marcus Aurelius, and they had only grown darker and more ominous as the empire endured first Commodus, then a succession of imperial assassinations, then a three-way civil war, then a humorless military dictatorship run by Septimius Severus, and then finally the cruel debauchery of his heirs. When Elagabalus was killed by the Praetorian Guard in 222, it seemed like the lightning and the thunder and the rain was about to start. But then a curious thing happened. The dark clouds just sort of hung there in suspended animation. No thunder, no lightning, no rain. Not yet, anyway. The empire was granted a stay of execution. The provinces flourished, the rule of law prevailed, and the burdens of life were eased. But in the end, it was just a stay of execution, not a full pardon. And when Alexander Severus was assassinated in 235, the thunder and the lightning and the rain finally arrived. When discussing the very worst emperors in Roman history, it is common to point out that the most striking similarity between Caligula and Nero, and Commodus and Caracalla and Elagabalus was how young they all were. The old man of that group is Caligula, who was all of 25 when he came to power. In fact, when you go back through the rolls, there are basically no examples of a Roman leader under the age of 30 being anything but a train wreck. The exception that proves the rule was, of course, Scipio Africanus, and he appears to have used up almost all the wisdom and talent the gods had ever planned on granting the under 30 set. In 222, though, Alexander Severus, ascending to the throne at the age of 13, broke this string of underage train wrecks. Somehow, he managed to scrape together whatever leftover residue of youthful competence Scipio had not sucked up for himself, and he used it to rule the empire with something approaching wisdom for more than a decade. Probably the biggest determining factor in Alexander not becoming a horrible train wreck was his mother. A fact that I'm sure will make every mother out there nod their head in agreement, and make every teenager out there roll their eyes in annoyance. But guys, it's true. As different as Alexander was from his cousin, so too was his mother, Julia Mamaea, different from her sister. Julia Mamaea loved her son and wanted him to be happy, but was not so indulgent that she just let him do whatever he wanted. She took very seriously the fact that as emperor, Alexander had very serious responsibilities. She had seen up close the corrupting power of, well, power, and so did her best to shield her son from its worst effects. As we will see, Julia Mamaea was no saint, and her own faults would become a big problem for the regime. But she was smart enough to know that her son would never last in power if he was allowed to give himself over to the pleasures of power while abdicating the responsibilities. And of course, standing over Julia Mamaea's shoulder the whole time, making sure that she did right by her son, was her mother, Julia Maesa, who would be damned if she was going to let some hormonal teenager blow the deal for her a second time. At 13, Alexander had neither the experience nor the education to run the government all by himself. Even with his mother and grandmother pulling the strings, there was simply not yet enough innate authority emanating from the boy to hold the regime together. So Julia Maesa went out a-calling on the most influential families in Rome and quickly organized a governing council composed of 16 widely respected senators. This had the effect not only of granting the new regime access to wisdom and experience it would not have been able to conjure on their own, but more importantly, it had the effect of co-opting the Senate. Bringing these 16 senators into the imperial fold meant cooling a potential hotbed of sedition and buying Alexander time to get on his feet. But, and this is where the Severans really played it smart, the governing council did not become just some blue ribbon photo op. They were given real, actual authority, and every day debated and resolved the real issues facing the empire. Alexander sat at their head, and as emperor, he had the final say in everything. But the men of the council were not only listened to, they were usually deferred to. The senators on the council acquitted themselves admirably, and Alexander was able to sort of ride his advisors' good sense all the way to Legitimacy City. He was lucky to have among their number 2 men of note who helped steer the ship of state wisely during these early years. First, the great jurist Gnaeus Domitius Annius Ulpianus, who we know today as Ulpian, and the historian Cassius Dio, whose 80-volume history of Rome has provided a lot of the material that your humble podcast is based upon, especially these last few episodes. I'll deal with Cassius Dio a bit more in a second, but right now I want to focus on Ulpian, who was the predominant force during Alexander's first year in office. He had been born around 170 and had risen quickly up the political ranks until he became a member of Septimius Severus' advisory board. He remained a high-ranking imperial official after Severus' death, and somehow managed to emerge from Caracalla's regime with his reputation intact. In fact, his reputation was so intact that when Elagabalus took power, Ulpian was banished from Rome for fear that he would prove to be a pain in the new emperor's far less virtuous backside. With Elagabalus' death, Ulpian was immediately recalled by Julia Maesa to serve on the council she was putting together to run the government for her son. Upon his return, Ulpian was named Praetorian Prefect and tasked most especially with untangling the knot of corruption and vice that had infected both the army and the imperial bureaucracy. Well above and beyond his distinguished political career, though, Ulpian is best known as a legal scholar of the First Order. Throughout his life, he wrote endless commentaries on the laws of the empire, and his work was so highly regarded that when Justinian was compiling his definitive body of civil law, the writings of Ulpian represented a full third of Justinian's Digest, the companion book to his more formal Justinian Code, which compiled authoritative legal opinions and gave them the force of law. But despite the esteem within which he was held by emperors, he wound up despised by the Praetorian Guard, and unfortunately was about to meet his mortal end. The first order of business for the council was to reverse the complete takeover of Rome by the sun god known as Elgabal or Sol Invictus, and reinstate traditional Roman religion. As we will see down the road, this did not mean banishing the sun cult completely by Elagabalus or return to their original deities. Indeed, the worship of Sol Invictus remained popular, and as previously noted during the History of Rome Christmas special, the popularity of the Feast of the Unconquered Sun perhaps played a role in the Christian decision to celebrate the birth of Christ on December the 25th. Once the council got Rome right with the gods, they then went through the roles of the bureaucracy and reviewed every single man Elagabalus had appointed during his 4 years in power. Those found to be unqualified or corrupt, which is to say practically all of them, were immediately purged and replaced by men of far greater merit. Before Alexander's first year in office was up, the Romans were back to performing the religious ceremonies they had always performed, and the government was back in the hands of men who knew what they were doing. Following the initial obvious moves to strip away the layers of Elagabalus' legacy, the council then set about instituting more ambitious reforms. Because they were not just dealing with the tainted legacy of Elagabalus, they were also dealing with the tainted legacy of Caracalla. Caracalla, you'll recall, had declared everyone in the empire a citizen so that they would all qualify for taxes that as mere subjects they had been exempted from. This had put an enormous financial burden on the provinces and was slowly eating away at their local economies. The big problem was that money that should have stayed at home was being shipped to Rome. Local municipalities were having a hard time raising revenue, and local merchants were having a hard time finding anyone who could afford their goods and services. And it's not like the money headed to Rome was being sent back in the form of imperial reinvestment. No, it was just landing in the emperor's pocket, and God knows what he was doing with it. So, soon after the governing council was formed, they initiated a mass cut of the insanely high tax rate that had been levied on the provinces. They balanced this reduction in imperial revenue by simply cutting back on all that lavish God knows what that Caracalla and Elagabalus had been up to. But their spending cuts, while well-intentioned, struck a nerve that was dangerous to strike: the army. The troops had been taught to expect salaries and donatives and bonuses that far exceeded what the treasury could actually afford. So when Alexander and his governing council attempted to realign military spending and fiscal reality, well, let's just say that the average soldier didn't care much about fiscal realities. He just knew that some skinflint back in Rome was holding out on him. The army had been corrupted completely by the unsustainable excesses of previous emperors, and now that someone who could tally up a debit column and a credit column and then compare the two was in charge, the army was in for a rude awakening. But actually, what happened was more like the governing council was in for a rude awakening when they discovered what happened when they tried to reduce soldier pay. The pushback claimed its first victim in 223, just a year after Alexander took office. Despite Ulpian's merits, or perhaps because of them, the Praetorian Guard quickly came to hate him for his annoying combination of frugality and discipline, and after a year of watching their privileges whittled away, the rank and file of the Guard finally snapped. We don't know what the last straw was, but in early 223, there is no other way to put this, the Praetorians went berserk. For 3 days, Rome was engulfed by riots between the Praetorians, who clamored violently for the head of Ulpian, and the general population, who loved him and attempted to defend him from the much better armed Praetorian cohorts. Finally, though, the civilian mobs were broken up on the third day, and Ulpian was left exposed. He managed to make it to the imperial palace, but despite the entreaties of Alexander, the soldiers murdered Ulpian right there at the feet of the young emperor. Their bloodlust sated, the guard returned to their camp, and calm returned to the city. Unfortunately for Alexander, though, and much to his embarrassment, there was little he could do about the riots or the murder. If he tried to come down on the Praetorians right away, they would just kill him as they had Elagabalus and find someone new to rule the empire. Though he was popular with the guard, he was not popular enough, and he knew it, so he had to endure